How exactly do you fight a war without, well, actually fighting? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the ultimate historical paradox, a massive 45-year global struggle where the two main superpowers literally never met on a single battlefield.
To figure out how that's even possible, we're unpacking some fascinating source material today, a comprehensive university lecture on political history. It traces the whole arc, the origins, the evolution, and the frankly shocking end of a conflict that completely shaped the modern world.
We are talking about the defining geopolitical rivalry of the 20th century, that decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, what was the Cold War? Then, from allies to enemies, containment and alliances, a global competition, and finally, the sudden collapse. Section 1. What was the Cold War? Defining the 45-year rivalry.
So, by 1949, both superpowers had developed atomic weapons, and that created a terrifying new reality known as mutually assured destruction. Basically, if one side attacked, the other would instantly retaliate, and they'd both be completely annihilated. It's wild to think about, but the invention of these world-ending weapons is actually what forced all this intense hostility into the shadows. Direct conflict was just way too catastrophic to risk.
At its core, this whole thing was a clash between two entirely opposite visions for human civilization. On one side, you have the United States with liberal democracy, free market capitalism, and individual rights. On the other, the Soviet Union with a Marxist-Leninist single-party state and a centrally planned economy. World War II had decimated the old global powers, leaving this massive vacuum, and these two totally incompatible systems were fiercely competing to fill it. Section 2. From Allies to Enemies. The breakdown of a functional partnership.
During World War II, the US and the USSR were allies strictly out of necessity to defeat Nazi Germany. But the second the war was won, that partnership completely fractured. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, the Allies agreed to hold free elections in Central and Eastern Europe. Yet fast forward just 3 years to 1948, and communist governments completely loyal to Moscow were already installed.
The mutual incomprehension here was just profound. Washington looked at these actions in Eastern Europe and saw a deliberate attempt at communist expansionism. But Moscow, they viewed it purely through the lens of survival. Having lost tens of millions of lives to Western invasions twice in a century, they saw these buffer states as an absolute security requirement. Two completely different security calculations colliding head-on.
This massive divide was famously crystallized by Winston Churchill in 1946 with his metaphor of an iron curtain. Long before any physical walls were built, Churchill gave the world a way to visualize a continent cleanly, permanently split into two incompatible halves, stretching all the way from Stettin in the Baltic down to Trieste in the Adriatic.
Moving on to Section 3, Containment and Alliances, Drawing the Battle Lines.
So how did the U.S. respond? Well, following the Truman Doctrine's commitment to support free peoples, the cornerstone strategic concept became containment, articulated by diplomat George F. Kennan. The idea wasn't to go to war and directly defeat the Soviet Union. Instead, containment meant preventing Soviet expansion anywhere it popped up, and then just waiting for the Soviet internal system to eventually evolve or just collapse under its own weight. And this strategic standoff quickly evolved into formal, massive alliance systems. In 1949, Western democracies established NATO, built around an Article 5 collective defense guarantee. In response, by 1955, we see the Warsaw Pact, locking in Soviet military dominance over the Eastern Bloc. The world was now neatly divided into two heavily armed camps, staring each other down across fortified borders.
Section 4. A global competition. The war fought through proxies.
Because direct confrontation literally meant mutually assured destruction, the superpowers fought violently through others. The rapidly decolonizing world basically became their chessboard. The US and USSR poured weapons, training, and funding into local conflicts across continents. So while we call it a Cold War, it was devastatingly hot for the millions of people living in proxy zones, places like Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Cambodia.
But the competition absolutely wasn't limited to the battlefield, or even to Earth. Take the space race. In 1957, the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite, completely shocked the West. It drove intense investments in science and education, culminating in the 1969 American Apollo moon landing. It was the ultimate proxy for proving which system had ideological and technological superiority.
Still, the terror of a direct clash was always lurking right there in the background. 13. That is the number of harrowing days during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviets deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, humanity came the absolute closest it ever has to an actual catastrophic nuclear war, before both sides finally stepped back from the brink.
Section 5. The sudden collapse. How a superpower ceased to exist.
The crazy thing is, the Cold War didn't end with a peace treaty or some massive final battle. It ended because of structural pressures. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing severe economic stagnation, they were bogged down in a hugely costly war in Afghanistan, they had an aging leadership, and they were under intense pressure trying to keep up with the U.S. arms race. The internal strain was just immense.
Recognizing these deep systemic issues, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and introduced two landmark policies to try and fix things. Glasnost, which meant openness, loosening censorship, and allowing public debate. And Perestroika, a restructuring of the economy and political system. Gorbachev actually introduced these hoping to save socialism by reforming it, but instead, they accidentally unleashed decades of pent-up political and nationalist pressures that just couldn't be put back in the bottle.
The sheer, breathtaking speed of the fall caught the whole world off guard. Gorbachev's reforms begin in 1985. Just 4 years later, in 1989, a wave of peaceful revolution sweeps across Eastern Europe, and crowds are physically tearing down the Berlin Wall with their bare hands. And by 1991, after a failed hardliner coup, the USSR formally dissolved.
45. After roughly 45 years, it was just over. A conflict that entirely defined global foreign policy and cast a terrifying shadow of annihilation over humanity for nearly half a century simply ceased to exist.
Our source material leaves us with a brilliant thought. For students of international relations, the Cold War is not merely history, it is a laboratory. Understanding these alliances, the proxy wars, and the incredibly rapid collapse of a system that seemed permanent, it gives us the tools we need today. So I'll leave you with this to think about. How does understanding this 45-year standoff help us make sense of the intense great power competitions that are actively shaping our world right now? Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep questioning the history that builds our present.